Good evening. My name's Joel Papadix. I'm the president of the American Watercolor Society, and I'd like to welcome everyone tonight. And it's my pleasure tonight to introduce our demonstrator. He's an internationally recognized artist, architect, and author based right here in New York City. Please join me in welcoming Tom Schaller.
Thank you all so much. So I'll try to do something worth your while tonight. I talk a lot about painting from imagination, and I do that. I paint a lot purely from imagination, meaning I pull things out of various orifices, and I keep a dream diary. A dream diary is important to me, a little sketchbook by my bed. I don't go anywhere without a sketchbook. I think as creative people, visually creative people, we need the ability to channel what's going on in here and here as quickly as possible here, outside ourselves. Sketchbook for me, it's not the only way, but for me, it's the best way for me to channel directly that electric jolt between creativity and expression. How do you get there as quickly as you can? A dream diary helps. I sketch when I'm falling asleep or sometimes when I wake up. Just doodle. No judgment, no critique, just what develops. Surprisingly, a lot of crap. But more surprisingly, now and then, it taps into your subconscious and a creativity you maybe didn't know was there or available to you. I also want to just give a little caveat. There's no one right way to do anything. So what I talk about tonight while I'm doing this painting for you should not in any way be construed as, this is the way to paint. What the hell do I know? I'm just figuring it out. Every day is new for me, and I love that. So I have my way. I didn't invent water or color. You are welcome to borrow, steal, and frankly, reject anything that I talk about. It's all up for grabs. Each of us will put all the different pieces of our observation together in our own unique way. Nobody can paint like you, and nobody can paint like me, not because I'm so great, but because we all have our own unique creative DNA. So today, where we are in the world, the painting I'm doing for you, it's about imagination and inventiveness, but it's really about design and using those things I just talked about. How do you look at a scene with your eyes, make something more personal out of it, better perhaps, different, using your imagination, your memory, and inventiveness. So I decided to paint a real place, but with my spin on it, so that it'll hopefully not look like the real place, but more importantly, feel like it. I urge my students, to their annoyance, never paint what you see, try to paint what you feel. Paint what you experience. Paint how this place, this person, this thing makes you feel. So that's what I'm going to try to do. So lecture over. So where we are to place us is Central Park here in beautiful New York. This is at the southeast, southwestern corner of the park, looking across the pond at the buildings along Fifth Avenue. It's one of the most beautiful scenes in the world. It also, I think, as a demonstration painting, is a good example of what works for me. I think we all need, when we want to be a painter, to find a way in. What's your hook? What's your way into art? For me, it's the idea of contrast. I don't just mean light versus dark, although I do, but in addition, I mean energies, vertical energy contrasted with horizontal energies. Light versus dark, yes. The natural world contrasted with the built environment. These kinds of things are simple, but they're really endlessly inspiring. You'll never, ever run out of things to paint if you find your way into art. For me, it's this idea of contrast. What's real, what's imagined? What's there, what's no longer there? What might be there in the future? I play around with time, with times of day, with lighting, with color. Two opposing forces meeting on the surface of the paper, trying to find a resolution. That is art for me. Every work is better when you have an intention behind it. Rather than just painting a copy of a photograph, That's not good enough. Find a story, find a narrative, find an experience. Try to focus on that. Again, that's my way in. It may be very different for you, and I'm disparaging no one. I mean, if we're painting at all, we're better off. So whatever gets you to paint, focus on that. So here's the actual view. There's the pond in Central Park. This is one of my favorite buildings in the city. This is the Sherry Netherland Hotel, built in 1929. So I haven't rejected all of my architectural past at all. So I like this view. I could take this photograph and copy it, but I won't do that. I think I could do something a little more interesting than that. I wanted to work in a little bit of the Plaza Hotel, which shows in this photo. And then I think I want an overall better, more balanced, and hopefully more poetic composition. So I took all these different influences, and this is very typical for my technique. I always never go anywhere without my sketchbook. I worked up this little diagrammatic compositional idea. So here, I'm playing around with, obviously, the placement, the location of shapes. Painting has often been described as nothing more than a design of shapes on the page. Largely that's true. Shapes of value, darks, lights, midtones. I want to say this too. Obvious, we're painting on a flat two-dimensional surface. All we have as a painter are two dimensions, height and width. I believe, for me, it's much more interesting if you can do anything to begin to imply that illusion of three-dimensionality, depth in your painting, something that pulls you into the painting and tells that magical story, and you can fool the viewer into thinking this is literally three-dimensional. One way to do it, there are two main ways: linear perspective, vanishing points, and the horizon line and all that nerdy stuff, which I love. But it's only one way. Another way to do it is by the layering of values, darks, midtones, lights, and then placing them in a spatial alignment, one to the other. There's no one right way to do that. Lots of ways work. This diagram shows me thinking this through. So what I have done is I've placed the light in the background and a little bit in the midground in the water. And I've decided to go with a vertical composition. Another thing a sketchbook really helps when you're looking at a scene, you have to decide fairly quickly, do I want to paint this as a horizontal, a vertical, a square, a circle, whatever. A sketch can answer so many of those questions before you mess up a painting. But what I'm trying to do with a vertical composition is it sets up different energy than a horizontal. A so-called landscape format, the horizontal, will establish an energy leading you through a painting from left to right or right to left. That's very useful for landscapes sometimes, for seascapes, for any other kind of subject matter. A vertical composition, by contrast, is very different. It leads your eye and your spirit through the painting from top to bottom, bottom to top, and it sets up connections. The sky connected to the land, connected to the water. I generally favor vertical compositions, though I try to not become habitual about it. But I just think they're more narrative rich. They have more to offer, often, not always. But for this subject, yes. I want to do this as a nocturne, an early evening view, where there'll be subtle light, a lack of detail. Another contrast, I want some detail and specificity contrasted with big areas of obscurity. And there's no better medium to do that than watercolor. The way you can change from clarity to obscurity. Watercolor can speak in a whisper or a shout, and it can do it in a very narrow range, and it's endlessly compelling to me. So I want to do a lot of that in this, but I put light in the background, a little in the midground to set up this connection, to pull the viewer's eye through the painting this way. The nearer background, the buildings that I see, some of the park along Fifth Avenue in the distance, will all be in midtones. I really do. I number my drawings. Lightest value is 1, midtone value is 2, and in this case, these dark trees that you can see here will form something like a foreground, a scrim almost, that's quite dark, through which you can look and see, hopefully, this beautiful scene beyond. So we have a very simple spatial arrangement of dark midground, midtone midground, light background. That, if I do it well, will really start to imply this sense of three-dimensionality. A lot of my students fear drawing or hate drawing, and they say, I hate to draw, I just want to paint. I get it, I do, but just speaking for me, drawing is the fundamental, it's the backbone of everything I do. So it's not the answer, but it is my answer. If I have a problem with drawing, is that I love drawing too much, and I can overdraw my underpainting, and that can be a problem because then the results can look a little bit technical and tight. So I have to kind of ratchet back and stop myself short. Everything I do is based on my love of drawing. I don't erase the drawn lines. I let them show through the watercolor when I'm done because it's part of the process, and I think they can work together nicely to form a more pleasing result. Setting up my palette here, I change my palette a good deal depending on what I'm painting, but generally speaking, it ranges from light to dark and from warm to cool, mostly. I don't tend to think of specific pigments or colors. If you go into a Daniel Smith store, there's so many pigments. If you don't really know what you're doing, you can go broke quickly. So I've been working for years to pare down, to edit my palette to just the pigments. I don't buy them because they're beautiful in and of themselves, but only in terms of how do they work with other pigments in my palette. So I arrange my palette light, dark, yellow, violet. That's a complement, obviously. And then two midtones. This is a Daniel Smith Burnt Sienna Light. And this is Daniel Smith Cobalt Blue, a very workhorse color. So these are midtones, largely, and these are lights, these are darks. I tend to think of my pigments that I paint with less about their color than about their value and their temperature. Are they warm? Are they cool? Are they light? Are they dark? I think it makes it simpler when you're starting out if you concentrate on those considerations more than, ooh, I love this pigment. This one has glitter in it. Proceed with caution. Over here, for this painting, I'm mixing up a little bit of orange. This is a Daniel Smith Permanent Orange. Not a color I use all the time, but I'm going to here because I want to wash this from a light to dark as an evening view. So one thing I picked up in studying the Beaux-Arts technique was the ability to run a graded wash, just a very simple wet wash. You have to use gravity. Another thing, I'm a little bit stunned that I see students of mine not employing the cheapest, the most available tool in our toolbox, gravity. Water, as I understand it, tends to run downhill. So if you know that, which we all do, and use that to your advantage, you have another tool. I tend to move my board around a lot while painting because it helps me to modulate the amount of tilt, gravity. With a very wet wash like this, by tilting the board left, right, up, or down, you can modulate how quickly the paint sinks into the fibers of the paper or how long it sits on the surface. And that'll change the intensity. You can save yourself a lot of trouble by avoiding blossoms and streaks just by using a lot of water and gravity. In the rest of my life, I'm not a fan of gravity, but in painting, it's my friend. So I'm grading this wash, as you can see, from a very pale yellow. I used a Naples yellow, down into that permanent orange that I mixed, a tiny bit of alizarin, and then this is a violet, imperial purple. So I'm doing a curvilinear, one big wet graded wash. Traditionally, the way you do a wash like this is to build up this bead of water, pull it down the surface of the paper. You're not literally supposed to touch the paper, but that's not realistic. But really, you're just modulating this bead of water, pulling it down over the surface of the page. And you can end up, if you're lucky, with an absolutely flawless, clean, graded wash. You can change color, as you can see, pretty easily. And then the other main thing that I want to talk about, what I love about watercolor, is I get asked a lot in interviews, etc., how do I paint light? And smartass that I am, I say, I don't. You don't paint light in watercolor. It's a subtractive medium. All the light is right there on the paper. 100% of the light that you're going to need is on the surface of the paper. What we do is we paint the shades and the shadows that reveal the light. We give the light expression by painting the dark. When you think about painting in watercolor in that way, about just modulating and carving away light to reveal the light, it made me realize that the coloration, the tonalities, the expression, the interest you give your shadows is infinitely important. So for me, no Payne's gray shadows, none of that unky indigo. I have as much luminosity and lightness within my shadows as I can do in the constraints that I have. Revealing the light by painting the shadows is just key for me. Again, I gotta say, it's not the only way to paint. There are many other ways to think about it, but it really, really works for me. I think one of the magic qualities of watercolor is the way one thing can just morph into, become something else. And that's by modulating the lines and the edges. Because this is sort of an early evening nocturne, I want a lot of ambiguity. By that I mean I want it to be a little bit difficult for one to see where the water starts and the land begins. So I'm letting each thing just melt into the other. So the trees here will just melt into the water. I'll save a little bit of clarity right here, that little thread. That's another kind of contrast I love in watercolors, the sort of toggling back and forth between clarity and ambiguity. It's very beautiful. This is cobalt teal, one of my favorite pigment colors, if I'm honest. It's cobalt teal blue, to be specific. I want to save some light right here in this area of the water. So one way to do it would be to paint around it, but another way, if you don't want a hard edge, which I don't think I do, is use one of these guys, a little mist bottle. This is my favorite brush because it's not a brush. It adds water. It helps washes mix together organically. It softens edges, and it's all around a lifesaver. So at this stage, I build my paintings up from the lightest light to the darkest darks. And as I said, the lightest light of all, of course, is the plain, untouched white paper. If you look at any of my paintings, there are some exceptions, but very few. There'll be some area of untouched white paper visible. But anyway, the lightest light, then I start in with the midtones, the lighter midtones up through the darker midtones. So for this painting, so far, I'm just focusing on the light, medium, and the darker midtone areas. This is a bit of jadeite green, another gorgeous Daniel Smith pigment. I was teaching in Seattle at Daniel Smith years ago, and whatever training I had in watercolor was of the type that said, you should never buy green pigment, just mix your own. I get it, it's not untrue. However, I said that out loud at Daniel Smith. And John, the president of the company, was in the back and took me after class to the factory. And long story short, I went home with an armful of green pigments that changed my life. I think the reason is I love the color green, but green pigment can be very unappealing sometimes. It tends to dry a bit gray and undistinguished. This jadeite green in particular is made out of real jade and minerals. So as it dries, the heavier sedimentary bits sink down into the valleys of the paper, and the less heavy bits float over the little mountaintops. And as it dries, you get this beautiful, luminescent, sparkly effect. It's gorgeous. It's not quite glitter. I tend to avoid, in terms of pigments, I tend to avoid the more absolutely stain-based pigments, like the phthalos, quinacridones. I'm not saying you shouldn't use them, but they don't work very well for me because I tend to not mix pigments in my palette. I paint mostly with pure color and allow it to mix on the surface. So all the neutrals are formed on the paper, not here. I also paint with pretty rough surface paper. That's because these kind of transitions can happen in a shorter amount of space, so they're more impactful and I think a little more elegant than I can get on a hot press or even a cold press. This very rough surface allows the sediment to sink, the water to float over, and then the colors and the tones and the values and the temperatures blend together and make these kinds of effects, which I find endlessly beautiful. And I'm also full of crap because I used to say I would never use Naples yellow because there's a bit of opacity to it. But I struggle finding a really beautiful yellow pigment that's just sort of a low-key neutral yellow that's not too acidic or too red or green. So yeah, the Naples yellow, it is. And usually it's the lightest yellow against pure white paper, so it works well. It's subtle. This is a rough surface paper, but it's Arches, 140 pound or 300 grams, same thing. Arches bright white. I use this a lot. I also use Bao-Hung paper, which is super textural, the rough surface. It's like painting on the lunar surface, but I love it. And occasionally I use Fabriano, Hahnemühle, Saunders Waterford. I really, really love. Very distinct texture. This is just a workhorse paper that'll work for just about anything, but there are other options out there. I never used to use flat brushes in my more classical bit of training I had in watercolor. Nobody used flats. They just all rounds. So that's how I grew up, thinking that was my only option. I lacked imagination. But I was on a painting trip with a bunch of other instructors in China a few years back, and somebody gifted me a whole pile of flat brushes. And I was grateful. I said thank you, but I also said to myself, well, I'll never use these. And then in my hotel room that night, I just started to play with them, and my world changed. And I don't know how I got along without flat brushes for so many years. And it was just that stubbornness, that thing you think you know that you're wrong about, was very eye-opening to me. Like, we have such fixed ideas and we're not always right, or we cut ourselves off from other options. So I learned a life lesson, but I also found a whole new way to paint. So I use now a lot of mops, more classical applications like the big Beaux-Arts style wash, but then I use a lot of flat brushes for more dry brush, gestural, skip start techniques, which are really handy. And the combination of 2 or maybe 3 types of mark making or brush applications within a single work can really add another layer of dynamics and interest to your paintings rather than just one way of doing it. What I'm using now is not an Escoda brush. This is a cheap brush I bought off the street somewhere. And I just mention it because there's a certain advantage in also exploring really cheap brushes. They're obviously synthetic. They can't hold a lot of water. But if you want to paint in a dry brush way, which is what I'm trying to do here, if the brush holds less water, you're able to make those really distinctive marks where you get those stippling, skip, start effects more easy, whereas a higher quality brush would hold more water and make a nice mark, which you may want. But if you want those skip marks, a cheaper brush can be the way to go. I just never want to encourage anybody to go out and spend a fortune on brushes. It's not always necessary. It's good to have a few good ones, but for me, the one place you ought to spend a little money is on the paper surface. As much as I love my brushes, you can do a pretty darn good painting with mediocre brushes if you have a really good piece of paper. So what I'm doing now is I'm just concentrating on shapes, mid-tone still, darker, but I'm painting in some of these background buildings that are important compositionally but aren't the star of the show. So I'm not focusing on details, I'm just concentrating on shapes. So I'm using here some of that imperial purple, I'm working in some Van Dyke brown, a little bit of warmth, and a little bit of blue just to give them some variety, but not all that important. Really just trying to make shapes. The building here that's almost in the center of the composition, which I was also taught you should never do. But painters like Caspar David Friedrich came along and told me, that's nonsense. Shove something right in the middle of your composition if it works. And he did it endlessly. If you haven't seen his show at the Met, and if you can, oh my God. He broke every classical rule that existed, and with such style. So what I want here to happen more than anything is the city, the buildings, to come down and just melt into the landscape. That's the overall effect I want. That most clearly represents my experience of Central Park. It's so unexpected and improbable. Okay, I'm saving this a bit because I want to make sure this is dry enough. This building, not really the focus. It's a bit of the star of the show, but I don't want it to pull forward too much, so I don't want it to get too dark. I want it to look a little mysterious, to fall into the background, to be haloed by this light behind it, a little bit of lunar nocturne effect. So I'm going to start at the top with one of these Neef brushes, a very small mop, which makes a beautiful point, but holds a good deal of water, so I can cover a lot of area if I need to. So this is still mid-tone, but it's getting close to the darkest dark, but not there yet. I'll be a little careful around the spire and the top of this building so that it looks a little bit more like the star that it is. This building was built as a residential hotel in the late 20s, and it's still there. Absolutely one of the most beautiful skyline buildings that exists. The architects, Schultz and Weaver, who also designed the Pierre, which is right next door, and they worked on the renovation of the Plaza, which is right here on the other side. I'm silhouetting the building pretty much. Some of you may be whispering to yourself, I'm just cheating by not showing any details, and you're not wrong. this is a good way to concentrate on shapes rather than details. The career that I spent so many years in would have ejected me completely if I didn't draw every little window, cornice, detail exactly correctly. So even though I still love to paint architecture and the urban environment, it's so liberating that I don't have any client telling me I have to draw every little window, because it doesn't matter. But honestly, it doesn't. The experience of a building is not, for everyday people, is not always so reliant on every little detail. It's usually its overall context and shape that makes the biggest difference. I'm trying to do this fairly fast so that I can melt this building into some of this nearer landscaping that I painted in a moment ago. I'm using this cheaper flat brush so I can get some of these dry brush marks. This, a tip, if you're painting streetscapes or urban views, if you do use flat brushes, they can imply a great deal of detail without you having to really draw or paint much of any of it. It's a real shortcut that's extremely handy. So it's such a distinctive profile that, I mean, as this dries, I could go back in and add detail, and I may do just a little, but I think it doesn't need much. It's just the shape that really counts. So what I want here is the bottom of these buildings to really just melt together with the trees and the landscapes so that the sky becomes the buildings become the landscape becomes the water. Everything is connected. It's all very zen. If I'm lucky, that's the effect I'll get. If I have fought over the years of anything to try to leach out of my work, it's this tendency to want to be too specific and too tight and too correct. That can be a problem as much as an upside. So I've drawn in perspective since I was 5. I can do it in my sleep. It's second nature to me. I love perspective drawings, but I think it can become a cul-de-sac you can get lost in. This search for perfection, you can lose bigger things. You can lose expression. You can lose emotion. But does it dilute the overall effect of the painting? And very often it doesn't. Sometimes it enhances it. It makes it look a little more human or hand-done. I encourage people to turn your boards around when you're painting. I do this even if I'm painting plein air. I'll fix my paper to my board and put it on an easel rather than keep it rigid in one place, because if I turn it, it's easier to reach, it's easier to use gravity, it just makes my life more comfortable. I do want to say I struggled with this perfectionism, this need to never make a mistake for far too long. I come from a big family and I have 1 million sisters, and it only takes one. But anyway, I was home complaining that I had to fly from Paris to Rome and teach, and what a horrible life. And my one sister, who was an ER nurse, just turned to me and said, well, after her second martini, to be fair, but she said, "Oh, shut up." I said, "Excuse me?" She said, "Stop complaining. You color for a living." I was so offended, but I said, "What?" She said, "If you do a bad painting, it's not like someone's going to die on the operating table." And I had to hand it to her. She's absolutely right. So she inadvertently did me a huge favor, because somehow, gradually after that, this was a few years ago, I started remembering how much fun painting really is. And even if I do a bad painting, I don't know, it's still better than 1 million other things I could be doing. So it's not so bad. And if I humiliate myself in front of a bunch of people doing a bad painting, oh well. It is fun. And we take ourselves so seriously sometimes. So I think from then, I'm not perfect by any means, but I got better at taking what I do seriously, but not taking myself that seriously. I really care about what I do, but I don't think in the big picture it's that important if I mess up now and then. So here, this wash is not dry. It's getting dry because the shine has gone off the paper, but I'm taking the opportunity to drop in some pigments, some deeper violets and greens to give a little, hopefully, interesting ambiguity to this architecture landscape melding going on over here. And you can play around in the wet for a long time before it starts to back up on you. But I think that's enough. I don't want to get that too detailed. It's far away, and I want it to look ambiguous, he says as he adds more. So there's trees back here, but they're not so important because these dark scrim of trees is going to be on top. So now what I want to do before this dries completely is bring this down, meld it into the water. I want everything in my painting to look connected, not as if it's paint by number, this area, this area, this area. I work on my whole painting as much as I can all at once. I never use masking. It's too time consuming. I see artists who use masking very well. I love it. I'm not good at it. But I also, in my work, prefer a hand-struck edge, even if it's messy, to an absolutely pristine edge, usually. In my former life as an illustrator, I would spend up to a week applying masking to a painting. And then you just have to peel it all off. And I like the vacation of not having to do that. But it means that I have to think very carefully where I want to preserve the lights in my painting. And I do. Do I always get it right? No, but those little sketches I do up front are very, very helpful. So at least I have a pretty good idea. This is Van Dyke Brown. It's just a simple warm tone. I'm using a small mop brush because it has a nice point. I'm trying to give a little bit of specificity and clarity to this band of land that sticks out and these rocks in the water that are starting to form around my center of interest, which is right here. The center of interest of your painting is almost always going to be where the darkest dark meets the lightest light. That's where the viewer's eye is going to want to go. So I'm trying to feature this as the primary center of focus and this as the secondary. And I want to set up a nice dialogue between the two to hopefully set up somewhat of a poetic connection between heaven and earth. Well, pretty lofty, but we'll see. So I want this landmass to look forward. So a good way to make something look far away, of course, is to have it less saturated in color, less contrast, less value, and softer edges. Also, the human eye generally tends to make things that are farther away from us tend to blue out a little bit, to look a little blue or blue-gray or violet. I don't always follow that rule, but so here, it's important for the overall composition, but not the most important thing. I don't want that much clarity along that water's edge. I'd like a little more ambiguity, so I'm going to use my trusty $3 mist bottle and lightly hit that so it softens. Give it a little more gravity. I'll save a little clarity right there, and I'll knock the rest of it back. This effect, I know you can get that in oil too, but I just don't think it works as easily as it does in watercolor or necessarily as beautifully. So I love that effect where you just see this, the clarity of this just melt into the shadows and become mysterious. So this is still midtone, but is edging up into my darkest darks, where all mostly going to happen here. So it's time to start thinking about them. Because I work on my painting all at once, I have to think about staging. Which area do I work on? If I want it connected, I have to think, I don't want that to get too dark or it won't bleed together, or I want this to get too dry so I can keep a nice clean edge. The darkest dark, I want to read forward of all of this, so edges are very important here. I want a lot of clarity of most of the edges, at least here in my center of focus. So this funky looking brush is it's a liner brush. Has a fat barrel at the bottom and long quills that stick out of the top. And I just stumbled across it. It's another one I bought at an art store in Rome or somewhere in Italy. I struggled with painting tree leaves a lot. They were too tight, too specific. And this allows me to really loosen up. I just push it across the surface, and I get a lot of variety of edges and some aeration that makes it look like tree leaves. So generally speaking, if I'm painting a tree, whether it be a palm tree or a deciduous, I'll do the areas of leaves first. Then before those areas dry, I'll paint in the larger areas of trunks and the major branches to connect. I think a lot of trees can look bad if the tree limbs and trunks and leaves look like they were painted separately and they don't look connected. So these are the Escoda Perla brushes, flats, an 1/8 inch and a little smaller. And these are really high quality brushes, but they're good flats. They hold a good deal of water. I am going to mix this too, just some neutral tint mixed with some of this Van Dyke Brown to just scrape in the major tree elements. As it dries, I'll add smaller bits later, but I want to try to establish the major parts of these dark trees so again they can bleed into the area of foliage so everything looks connected. Partially where I painted this line of trees behind, it's still a bit wet. Down here it's dry and up here it's dry. I want a variety of edges here, the sort of lost and found edges, which I think if I do it well will also help enhance the sense of mystery that you see in the evening, where you can kind of see things and you kind of can't. They kind of toggle in and out of focus. That's the overall look I'm going for. I think we are all probably our own most harsh critic. I am. But I look back at terrible paintings I've done in the past, like a week ago, and I just see trees that are just tortured, just way too much detail, way too careful, and I'm just always trying to learn more ways to take advantage of the fluidity of the medium, to really play up the wetness, what it offers, and make that a selling point to my paintings. But it is dodgy because I'm painting on a painting that's half sopping wet and half completely dry. So yeah, it's a little bit of a high wire act, but again, I just color for a living. So now here, of course, I'm getting right down into the center of focus. So everything in this area needs to be a little bit crystalline, a little more clear and crisp. So I'm going to use an Escoda, very small round brush, just to get a nice crisp point. This is pretty much out of the tube neutral tint, which is a pretty ugly color by itself, but it's a very useful tone. And this I reserve for tighter, more detailed work. Again, the overall aesthetic of this painting, I want it to be this toggle between specificity and obscurity, between stating and implying, between telling and making the viewer guess. I love all that. I think and talk a lot about observation. And I think when you go out to paint something on site, or even in the studio, but really on site, you're overwhelmed with stimulus, visual, sounds, smells. The sketch helps me breathe, quiet down, focus on what's really important. Like when you just look at a scene, somewhere instinctually inside, you know what's important. But if you don't take a minute to figure that out and to record it, at least if you're me, you'll end up painting too broad of a subject that's too inclusive, too much stuff going on. If you can focus it down to what's critical, edit out what's not, you're just going to be a much happier painter. And the sketch is the way I do that. Generally, I throw the reference photo away if I have it, because all it does is tell me what I'm doing wrong. And once you move past the reference photo to your sketch, you're in the realm of your own art, your own creativity. The reference photo is nothing but a stumbling block at that point. All right, so we're getting there, but the top of the painting is falling outside my center of interest. Everything that radiates from that point, with some exceptions, this being one, can become to get less and less important, less and less focal, and so therefore less detailed and less contrasty. So this tree, I want a lot of clarity there, but as it grows up through the painting, I want less and less and less, so that I don't pull the viewer's eye off the top of the page. So I'm painting quicker, more gesturally, sloppier, and I'm using less saturated colors, hopefully gradating from darker here to lighter here. And then as I get very near the top, I'll start to modulate this greenish warm with a little bit of this burnt sienna light to just de-intensify the color and help this tree organically fade off the page, keeping the interest down there. So up here, I like the modulation of color. I don't like the modulation of edges. So I'm going to soften the top of the page with my mist bottle. So I'll knock back some of these upper edges and keep the clarity down there. This again will help keep the focus where I want it, not where I don't want it. So I'm just fleshing out these big foreground trees. Obviously, this is still quite wet, which is what I want. This is drier down here, so I'm taking one of these mid-sized but smallish mops, just painting right up through all that wet, hopefully to connect everything and flesh out this side of the painting. I love painting trees because they're much like people. No two are quite alike. So I won't say you can't go wrong because, oh, you can. But you can get away with a lot. They have a lot of quirky personality. You're not doing tree portraits, you're just painting the idea of a tree. Big shape-wise, I'm pretty happy. I think this needs more texture to look a little more polished. And obviously this dark corner needs to be addressed, which is what I will do now. I want to speed myself up just a little. So I'll add a little additional texture in here while it's still a bit wet. connect some of these shapes. I want to leave a lot of aeration between the tree leaf shapes, etc. And I think good enough for now. But I think even at this stage, you can start to see these layers of value are starting to work. Background, midground, foreground, they're starting to evolve the way I had hoped. And also, I think it's starting to become more clear that the vertical format is something I'm making it the hero. Everything has sort of a vertical identity with some complementary horizontals, which I hope overall will look quite balanced. That's another thing that I try to teach, that if you do work in any kind of way where you have conflicting or contrasting ideas, one of them has to be the hero. So you can have a painting that's dominantly warm with bits of cool, or dominantly cool with bits of warm, but when you have a painting that's equal amounts cool and warm, it looks unsettled, it looks out of balance. So it's just something to think about. This painting, I'd say, is dominantly warm, but there's some pretty strong cool elements, and they may take over before I'm done, which gives me pause. But so far, so good. Right. So most of the tree identity is in. I think it needs some really smaller twigs that I'll do later with a smaller brush, but I want to get the big elements all established, which would be this landmass and then the reflections. So before this dries completely, I'll drag these shapes down into that area. Tonality doesn't matter too much here, or color doesn't matter too much. This is mostly a value exercise. I say this a lot. I don't know if I always stand by it, but generally it holds true for me, is that color is so often the question, but value is almost always the answer. I look at so many paintings that could really be improved if they just had a slightly better value design. And again, it's not a rule, it's not always the case, but often it is. So I urge students to work up a value study first, so at least you have an idea of where you want your lightest lights and your darkest darks to go. Just that much, you're going to be so much ahead of the game. So for this landmass, it's really just a dark shape, pretty backlit and silhouetted, but I'm dropping in some cool, some warm tones to modulate. Another little thing that I figured out along the way, that if you want a shape to appear dark, you do not have to grab a tube of Payne's gray or indigo or black. If you have the leading edge of that shape pretty dark against the light, within that shape you can drop in much lighter luminous colors that will still have a lot of clarity, and the whole shape will still hang together as dark as long as the leading edge of it maintains its deeper value. So the last important thing to do is to connect this down through the dark foreground water with a sense of reflections. That can be pretty simply done. The more complicated I try to make it, I have a feeling the worse it's going to look. So I'm going to try to just take a deep breath and paint it quickly. Another useful thing I learned the hard way was years ago, I fell out of a tree in Hawaii. Drugs and alcohol were not related, just my innate clumsiness. But anyway, I broke my back and I really mangled myself. But anyway, I'm fine. But part of my rehab was I had to start taking yoga. And I didn't want to. Everything in me resisted it. Honest to God, it changed my life. And I'm only bringing it up because there's one or two aspects of it that made me a better painter. The main thing was breathing. I never realized it, but for years I sat at a drawing table. I clutched my pencil and my brushes for dear life, and I held my breath for 20 years. I suffered from chronic backaches, migraines, headaches. All I had to do was start breathing, and it all went away. It was shocking. It was such an easy fix. I had no idea. Then, as I loosened up, I began to paint more with my whole arm, a little bit with my whole body. I started standing up to paint, which I do at home. And I know we can't all do that for various reasons, but I just urge you, as much as you can, if you can't stand and paint, stand for a little while, or at least be cognizant of trying to paint with your whole arm or your whole body. Everything will be more fluid. You'll be a lot happier. You'll have a lot fewer headaches. It's so incredibly worth it. So, yeah, yoga, okay. So here I'm just scraping in some shapes that I want to imply as if they're some ambiguous reflective shapes. And not bad, but I think it needs an anchor tone along the bottom. Another favorite brush is this 3/4 inch Escoda flat Versatile series. And I use this a lot for some kind of dry brush marks, but also for anchoring. I'll very often paint up from the bottom of the painting like this and sort of lift off quickly. And you can connect, you can add value without running a old school Beaux-Arts wash, but you can add sort of an anchor of value to the bottom of a painting, connect shapes here and there if you need, add some character marks, essentially adding connectivity, and it works quite well. Overall, I'm not unhappy with this, but I want to add a little bit of luminosity to that spot, so this narrative of light coming right through, I want to brighten this up, so I'm just going to hit it with the mist bottle. It'll wash away some of that pigment subtly and kill that line. Another thing is this, if you paint wet like this, if you mop up the end of the bead, this isn't because I'm neat and tidy, far from it, but what this does is it stops that bead of water from leaching back into the wash and causing a streak, which it will do in a matter of moments. I want to add a little bit of identity to this tree, so I'm going to use this very tiny Escoda Versatile brush. Just almost no water. This is Van Dyke Brown. Hold your brush back as far as you can, which I'm not that good at. Breathe. And just paint with your emotion rather than your brain. Trees, it's especially useful, this sort of calligraphy that you can get. A lightest touch as possible helps. If you press down too hard, it'll ruin the effect. So I'm adding these for identity, yeah, but also to add some additional connectivity to some of these various shapes. And I think a little of this goes a long way, but I'm just doing this to add some texture and some connectivity. As the water or the pigment begins to run dry, you can use it to add some dry brush marks for some additional identity and texture. I have a couple of pigments in my palette often that are officially semi-transparent, but if I'm entering paintings into a transparent show, like the Transparent Watercolor Society, I can't use them. But I have a Naples yellow that has a little bit of opacity to it. And then I have this crazy pigment lavender, which I adore. It's a Holbein pigment that I've been guilty of overusing. But it's the same. It's semi-opaque. I don't use any gouache or truly opaque paint, no. And it's not because I'm a purist, not at all. I just think the pigments that play together best end up making better results. So trying to keep everything as transparent as I can generally is worth the effort. But speaking of lavender, I'll often splatter lavender into wet dark green paint. This is a technique I don't recommend very highly because I have a distaste for watercolor gimmicks, and this is one. So a little of this can go a long way, but against a dark green pigment, because it's semi-opaque, it's heavy, it sinks down through the water, and then floats up and makes these purposeful mini blossoms in the wash that can be very beautiful against water or deep green trees. But again, a little goes a long way. But it can add texture and sort of a sense of light. And but if you go too far with it, it can start to look very heavy. If I'm an expert in anything, it's overworking a painting. So I also have advice there. I don't know how useful it is, but when you hear that voice inside your head say, maybe I should just do, maybe it needs just this one last, that whiny voice, pay attention. Don't do it, whatever that is. If you really need it, you can do it later, but don't do it then if you're not 100% certain. I think paintings look better when you stop just a little short rather than if you kick them over the finish line and they're tortured. So what I'm doing now is just the last little marks with the end of this liner brush, adding some textural foliage just to add additional focus and highlight to this focal point. You see I'm going not opaque, but very little water, so it's pushing opacity, and it really starts to play with that sense of three-dimensionality because of the softer edges, the desaturation of the distant colors, and then the additional saturation of the foreground colors. You get that convincing sense of depth and dimension. I'm assessing the painting. All the big parts are done. What I'm doing, though, while I'm yammering, is assessing whether I need to add any sense of detail to the top of the building. I think I do, but I want to do it very discreetly. I couldn't have done it before. I think I needed to get all the values established. That way it's easier for me to assess what, if anything, is needed up there. And I think a little is needed, but not too much. So I'm going to go for the small, flat perla. It's 1/8 of an inch, a number 4. I don't want to go too dark, so I'm going to use raw umber, which is a very neutral, soft brown, brownish. And see if this works. A little of this would go a long way, and it would be very easy to over-detail this and make it look too technical and tight, and I don't want that at all. So I'll just experiment. Yeah, I think that's fine. But again, a little bit is all that's needed. This is the stage of a painting where I can overbake it. So, yeah, that's just a tiny bit of identity to that tower, I think helped. But as I get down here, you could start to over detail it and it could all go south. It's the good news about watercolor, it's never too late to ruin it. You can overcook it so quick. So I am going to call it a day. It may look different on screen. Thank you all so much.